Today, I'm gonna tell you the story of an absurd underwater exploration, the day when the first human reached the deepest point of the ocean. Our submarine went into quarantine again. Everything was scheduled, all set. He was going to the water on March 29th, exact place, plotted. We only knew which boat we were gonna take him there with, how long it would stay, who was going with us, but the pandemic didn't give us a chance. So, in the meantime, we're studying submarines like crazy here, and some stories are emerging that are worth telling. Let's start then by our destination. Where is the deepest point in the ocean? It's in the Pacific Ocean, south of Japan, west of the Philippines, and it's called the Mariana Trench. It's a kind of a giant valley that is very deep there, and within the Mariana Trench there is an even deeper point, the deepest of all, which is called Challenger Deep, or in Portuguese, it's Depressão Challenger. This point is nothing less than 10,929 meters below sea level. This number can vary a bit depending on the measurement. There's a difference of a few meters, but either way, practically 11 kilometers underwater. It's hard to get to this place, but there's a problem that's much bigger than most people imagine. There's a water pressure there, but it's strong, but on a level. For every 10 meters of depth, the atmospheric pressure increases by 1 unit. So this water starts to weigh as you go down. The weight at 10 meters is 1 atmospheric pressure. At 20 meters, it would be 2 atmospheric pressures. 30 meters, 13 atmospheric pressures. When you reach 11 kilometers deep, it's over 1,000 times the atmospheric pressure. If it were our little submarine under that pressure, it would do this to it, because it's a lot of pressure. Just to give you an idea, in a spaceship in a space station, the difference between who's inside the ship, who's outside, is at most 1 atmospheric pressure. It's from the Earth's atmospheric pressure to the vacuum, 1 pressure. There, it's over 1,000, but there were people who wanted to get to that place. So, let's go back to the 1950s in Switzerland. There was a family named Picard. They were scientists, they were balloonists, aviators, and divers. Manuel del Mundo will still get there. One fine day, the patriarch of the family, Auguste Picard, decided to make a submarine that would descend to a great depth. It was a submarine that was more for descending, and his idea was not to keep walking down there. So it wasn't exactly a submarine, it was a Bathyscaphe, which is basically a submarine that doesn't have propulsion. The difference between a Bathyscaphe and a submarine is similar to the difference between a helicopter and a balloon. The submarine would be the helicopter. It's something that flies, moves in the air, right? It can go forward, backward, move wherever it wants. The balloon would be the Bathyscaphe. It also flies, moves, but it's kind of at the mercy of the winds there. The Bathyscaphe is in the sea at the mercy of the currents. And this term Bathyscaphe was invented by the Picard family themselves when they built their Bathyscaphe. Look at this little beauty we made here at Manuel del Mundo. This is the Trieste Bathyscaphe. It's what they built in the 50s in Italy, in the city of Trieste, and it's basically a huge submarine that doesn't have an engine. It only has some small control motors for positioning, very weak, in which there is a giant buoy on top and a steel sphere where people stay, a cabin down here. Completed in 1953, this vessel made several explorations at the bottom of the sea, but the goal was to reach an absurdly deep place. And for that, it's not enough to have built a cool machine and be a super and well-qualified family. You need heavy support. And they got perhaps the best support they could imagine. In 1958, the Picard family sold the Bathyscaphe to the American Navy. And the coolest thing is that they didn't abandon the mission. The 2 people chosen to travel with the Trieste were a Navy Lieutenant, Don Walsh, and Auguste Picard's son, Jacques Picard. The mission was set to reach the deepest point of the ocean. Only the Bathyscaphe Trieste was not exactly a perfect machine. So the American Navy made several reforms, including changing the very metal capsule in which they would descend there and below. Until in 1960, they were ready to descend. One of the biggest challenges of this Bathyscaphe was to take the creature to where it needed to descend. Just to give you an idea, it was 50 tons when empty. Just the steel capsule down here for 2 people weighed 14 tons. So it couldn't be placed on top of the ship that easily. It had to be towed, but it's an extremely delicate machine, so it had to be towed in a very slow manner. The speed at which they were towed was 4 knots, which is 7 kilometers per hour, but a little bit. It's the same speed that we set to tow our own submarine on March 29th, and it didn't happen, but it will happen. On January 23rd, 1960, they reached the Mariana Trench. The sea was terribly rough, shaking, waves hitting their heads, and they lost two very important instruments. The first was a surface phone. It was the phone to communicate between the capsule, the cabin they were in, and the crew working on the deck, who were preparing the Bathyscaphe to descend. The second equipment was a tachometer, designed to measure the descent speed of the guys. And then, at that moment, they had to decide if this adventure was really worth it without these two important pieces of equipment. And they decided that it was indeed worth it. Then, it was time to descend. How does this little thing here descend? This steel capsule, you must imagine that it sinks like a marble when you throw it in the water, right? So it needs a very big buoy on top. The buoy is this yellow part here on top. Do you know what's inside this? Gasoline, that's right, you heard it. Gasoline? You couldn't put a gas here because as they went down, the sea would start to squeeze more and more. The weight of the water would turn this thing into a crushed can. So they needed to put a liquid in, because liquids, they compress very little. In fact, we usually learn that liquids are not compressible. If you take water, for example, try to squeeze it to make it smaller. In theory, it doesn't get smaller. All this under normal conditions, here on the surface. The moment you're 11 kilometers deep, it's a different story. Just to give you an idea, water compresses 5% and gasoline 13% down there. But despite compressing a little, it could protect the hull. It wouldn't let the water dent the hull. Another key point is that gasoline is less dense than water, so it floats on water. A liter of gasoline weighs 700 grams on a scale. And if you put water, it will weigh 1 kilogram. Just look at the difference between the two. So this ensures that this gigantic tank of gasoline makes sure that this capsule here won't suddenly sink. Thinking of a balloon after all, these guys were also balloonists. It's as if this here was the balloon's basket, and up here we had the airbag that lifts the balloon. They didn't want to fly or even float in the sea like a coconut. They had to go down. How do you go down in this thing? First, they would enter this tunnel and lock themselves in, and inside the metal capsule down below. This tunnel is like a hole that will fill up with water. To descend, they had two water ballasts, one in front and one behind the Bathyscaphe. Yes, exactly like our submarine. When the Bathyscaphe is up there, these two reservoirs are full of air, then they open a valve, they start to fill with water, and the Bathyscaphe will start to descend. Oh, exactly like our submarine. To show this descent well, we're going to do a scale play here. We put this ruler and built this beautiful replica of the Bathyscaphe Trieste, which is in a 1:100 ratio. This means that each centimeter on the ruler corresponds to 1 meter in reality. So here we have 100 meters deep. It's exactly compatible with the Trieste. It's in the same proportion. So he started to descend here in a few seconds, reached 5 meters deep, which is the maximum we've reached with our submarine. Another equipment worth explaining on this descent was the Bathyscaphe's ballast. Yes, despite the buoy and the capsule, it had a metal ballast, just like our submarine, which by the way uses lead ballast, which is a more noble metal than the steel they used in theirs. But the cool thing about this story is that it was an ejectable ballast. Here they had 2 tanks full of steel balls, about the size of these balls here, which are magnets, right? And if they needed to drop some of the ballast, they could open it up here using an electromagnet, and then the balls would start dropping, coming out like a liquid. These electromagnets that worked as if they were the ballast tap worked in a somewhat inverted way. The moment you put energy into the electromagnet, they would close the tap, no ballast would come out. When you cut off the power, they would discharge, letting the ballast go. This is very important because if there was a blackout in the Bathyscaphe, they would let all the ballast out and the Bathyscaphe would rise. But why, after all, do we need a ballast that can be released? Why do we keep dropping the ballast along the way? Because as the Trieste goes down, it picks up speed. And that happens because the gasoline is compressing. It does so both due to pressure and temperature, because as it cools down more and more, the gasoline shrinks, and as it shrinks, they have to let some water in, otherwise the Bathyscaphe's hull will crumple. This makes the Trieste become denser and denser. It becomes denser, so it descends faster. To slow down this descent, they need to throw out some ballast. Then, it improves its density, it slows down the descent and manages to control it, otherwise it would go all the way down. Just to give you an idea, for every kilometer they descended, they had to throw away a ton of metal. But we are still at the beginning of our journey. They were descending there in the first 50 meters. When they reached 100 meters, the Bathyscaphe stopped descending. This occurred because they entered an area with very cold water. But the Bathyscaphe was still inside with the temperature up there. This means that it kind of gained buoyancy and could no longer descend, and they reached a dilemma. Yes, there was a mechanism there to help the Trieste descend. It's the opposite of ballast. A gasoline one right here in the middle. This one I painted orange. They could release the gasoline and let the water in. It's kind of a gasoline ballast here. They could use that now. The issue was they had only descended 100 meters and were already going to use up the gasoline they were conserving. So they had this option or wait for all the gasoline to cool down. If it cooled down, they would lose buoyancy again and would start to descend. The problem with this second option is that, besides wasting time, they would also lose oxygen, because they are breathing underwater, so it's not a very interesting thing. You can likely guess what they selected, can't you? Gasoline show, go away, because we want to get off. They dumped some gasoline and the Bathyscaphe kept descending. You can see it has shrunk, right? This happened because we changed the scale here, which is now 1 to 1,000. Each centimeter corresponds to 10 meters. You can see that our little Bathyscaphe here is only 2 centimeters because it was about 20 meters long. When they reached 500 meters deep, there was no light at all, darkness at the bottom of the sea. And of course, at that moment, it was already quite cold, so the guys changed clothes, put on a dry coat and everything else, and continued to descend. At 700 meters, they began to see plankton glowing at the bottom of the sea. It's kind of like a marine firefly. This phenomenon is called bioluminescence. They are living beings that emit light. This is so beautiful that the guys turned off all the lights because they wanted to see the marine life down there, which is sensational. They continued descending until reaching the end of our scale, which only measures up to 1 kilometer deep. But relax, our scale can change again. Now it's from 1 to 10,000. This means that each centimeter on the ruler corresponds to 100 meters, and the Bathyscaphe here becomes very tiny, with 2 millimeters in length. And it keeps going down. 7,300 meters below sea level. This was the previous record. It was the deepest anyone had ever managed to go, and in this case, this record was held by Trieste itself, which had made this descent a little earlier there in these depth studies. This means that, from there, they were already navigating in water at a depth that no human being had ever descended in the history of planet Earth, and it was quite an achievement already. At 8,800 meters deep, a danger began to appear. They were getting close to the bottom and they could hit the bottom. So they did 2 things. They turned on a depth probe, a sonar, to know how far they were from the bottom, but this sonar only reached 400 meters. So they would only know when they were very close. And they also slowed down the descent speed to go very slowly. "9,800 meters. They felt a jolt and a somewhat strange crackling. Dom Walsh asked, "Have we reached the bottom?" Picard replied, "I don't think so. The depth sensor isn't showing anything." At that moment, they stopped descending and turned everything off. Absolute silence to understand what was happening. They heard a noise that sounded like ants passing outside of the Trieste, or as if the water was shattering as it moved. And they asked, "Are we hitting the shrimp? Is the paint cracking?" I don't know. Let's keep going down. And then our scale ends at 10 kilometers deep. How the guys went ahead. I can't make our micro Bathyscaphe go down anymore. After a while, the sonar started to show that there was something there. And when it got to 200 meters from the bottom, they were sure. It was very close. This time is cool, but it's very dangerous, because if there's a rock down there, if the rock pokes the gasoline reservoir, it's over. Like, the Bathyscaphe goes to hell. So they had a pretty clever mechanism to slow down the descent. Of course, they had already reduced the descent speed. This rope, this extremely thick and heavy steel cable was the secret. As you might have guessed, this steel cable reaches the bottom first, and it starts coiling there. It touches the bottom of the ocean, and its weight can already be disregarded from the Bathyscaphe, because it doesn't weigh anymore. It's touching the bottom. It's not that it doesn't weigh anymore, right? But it no longer has influence on the Bathyscaphe. This means that the density of the Bathyscaphe increases, it floats better, and then it descends slower and slower. 4 hours and 47 minutes after starting the descent, the Trieste Bathyscaphe touched the bottom and reached a place where no human being had ever thought of touching. I mean, someone had thought about touching it, but no one had ever gotten there. But after all, what is in the deepest place in the ocean? What's there? A forest at the bottom? A shipwreck? What is it? There's not much there. Basically, it's a sand pit at the bottom. There's no rock in the place they were. They made some measurements. The temperature is 3 degrees Celsius. It's very cold. There's no current, which means the water is still, and there's also no radiation. 0 level radiation. But the coolest thing is that there was life. Even at that absurd depth, there were still living beings passing by their window. The first thing they saw, they thought it was a flounder, that fish that stays at the bottom of the sea with 2 eyes facing up, but they didn't see it very well, and nowadays everyone thinks they saw a sea cucumber. The second animal they saw it very well. It was a shrimp that passed by their window. By the way, if you're imagining that it's a super panoramic thing, that they looked 360 degrees down there, it wasn't quite like that. They had 2 windows, one was facing out, this one they could see the bottom, and the other was facing this access tunnel. The windows, made of cone-shaped acrylic blocks, were designed to withstand immense pressure. Speaking of resistance, let's understand a little about what the wall of this sphere they were inside was like. The sphere was 2 meters and 20 in diameter, very tight. But what thickness do we need to withstand 1,000 times atmospheric pressure? The bodywork of a car is about 1 millimeter thick. It's equivalent to this square here. The bodywork of the International Space Station is 3 millimeters thick aluminum and already withstands that difference there of 1 atmosphere. The gas tank, the float of the Bathyscaphe, was made of steel and was 5 millimeters thick. The capsule they were inside was made of an ultra-resistant steel alloy with molybdenum and everything else. And the thickness was more or less, it's this one here, between 13 and 17 centimeters of steel. It's a lot. Even to carry this thing is a lot. It's almost 30 kilos, so you can imagine the weight of their capsule. The last discovery they made at the bottom was not very pleasant. They took a look at the window that is here in the access tunnel and saw that it was cracked. The noise they had heard had come from this crack. It's time to go up, right? In the end, they only stayed down there for 20 minutes. Let's go up. Then they started to discard a little bit of the ballast and all was good. The Bathyscaphe gains buoyancy and starts to rise, and it also speeds up on the ascent. And that causes a small problem there. The first time I read about this expedition, I imagined they had descended with a steel cable on the side there to serve as a guide, right? After all, the Bathyscaphe can't go forward or backward. Something has to help there. They have a sight. Except there is no such cable of steel. That means they don't know exactly at which point on the surface they will emerge. And that's extremely dangerous. After all, the Bathyscaphe, when it's full of gasoline and everything else, it weighs 150 tons. If this hits the hull of a ship that's waiting up there, oh, it's bye-bye. The solution to this is as simple as possible. They made an isolation circle there on the surface, so no boat could approach within a radius of 4 kilometers, and at some point they were going to emerge there in the middle. Although the Bathyscaphe rises increasingly faster, the speed eventually stabilizes upon reaching the terminal velocity. It's more or less like a person when they parachute. There comes a time when the speed becomes constant because of air drag, in this case here because of water drag. And this terminal speed was not very fast. It was 5 kilometers per hour, so they took more than 3 hours to reach the surface. Despite the scare they had down there, they managed to arrive absolutely unharmed up there. Nothing happened to them, and this adventure is so difficult, but the difficult is such a complicated place to reach that the next person who managed to get there at the bottom did this in 2012, and it was the filmmaker James Cameron. Well, the guy, besides being one of the greatest film directors of all time, he is also passionate about submarine exploration. His documentary about this trip is worth watching. Our submarine adventure won't be that daring. 10 meters deep is our limit, but we had to develop a lot of technology. And when we study the history of the Trieste, we are very happy because we realize that several problems that we faced, they also faced, of course, in a much more advanced way. But the ballasts, the protection, the difficulties are quite similar. If you enjoyed this adventure story video, leave a comment below. We want to make more content like this on Manual do Mundo. I think it works.